He left his wife and daughter to take care of his sick mother, but when she showed up unannounced, what she saw shattered everything. Grace thought she had the perfect family, until her husband vanished into silence and excuses. With her daughter by her side and a knot of suspicion in her chest, she made a quiet journey to uncover the truth. What she discovered wasn't just betrayal. It was an entire life built without her. This is the story of a woman who was erased and came back stronger not for revenge, but for justice. The hallway was dark except for the golden glow bleeding from underneath the front door. Grace stood still for a moment, key in hand, listening. Silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the hollow kind. The kind that echoed through empty rooms and answered no question. She turned the knob and entered quietly. Zoe's little shoes were by the mat, her backpack slumped to one side. The smell of reheated mac and cheese lingered faintly in the air, and a crayon rolled off the coffee table as Grace passed. "Mom!" Zoe's voice, bright and full of relief, pierced the quiet. The 7-year-old girl came bounding down the hallway, her brown curls bouncing. She wrapped her arms around Grace's waist before Grace even had time to put her bag down. "You're late today," Zoe said, her voice muffled against her mother's coat. "I'm sorry, sweetie," Grace said softly, crouching to hug her. "There was an emergency at the hospital, but I'm home now." Zoe grinned, then quickly dashed off to fetch something from the fridge. "I saved you the last pudding," she announced. Grace smiled weakly and nodded, but her eyes drifted toward the family wall in the living room. Drawings, old photos, and Zoe's school projects filled the corkboard. In the center, taped just yesterday, was Zoe's latest drawing, a family of 3 standing under a blue sky. The mother and daughter held hands. The father figure stood slightly apart but smiling. Grace stared at it too long. "He didn't call today either," Zoe said, her tone suddenly small as she returned with the pudding cup. Grace blinked, pulling herself back to the present. "Daddy must be busy taking care of Grandma Carol," she said, repeating the same excuse she had clung to for nearly a month now. "He's very sick, remember?" Zoe nodded, unconvinced. "But I miss him." "I know." Grace reached out and gently brushed her daughter's hair from her forehead. "I miss him too." After Zoe went to bed, Grace sat in the kitchen alone, her hands wrapped around a lukewarm cup of tea she hadn't touched. The quiet was unbearable. She scrolled to Ethan's name and hovered over it. Her thumb hesitated, then retreated. Her eyes landed on a paper taped to the fridge. Zoe's weekly schedule. In the corner, Zoe had written in crayon, "Friday, Daddy picks me up." Grace stared at it for a long time before reaching out and slowly tearing it down. That night, lying in bed beside the spot Ethan hadn't filled in weeks, Grace replayed the recent days in her head. Fewer calls, no video chats, vague texts like, "Can't talk, Mom's resting." One weekend visit, then nothing. Not even for Zoe's school recital. Not even when Zoe had cried herself to sleep. Outside, the wind moved the branches across the window. Inside, Grace finally admitted something she hadn't allowed herself to believe until now. Something was wrong. And it wasn't just Carol. The next evening, Grace sat across from her oldest friend at a small booth in a quiet cafe 2 blocks from the hospital. Karen Doyle, still in her white coat and ponytail, was sipping decaf coffee while eyeing Grace with concern. "So let me get this straight," Karen said. "He hasn't FaceTimed Zoe in 2 weeks, and he's not replying to your messages unless you practically beg." Grace stirred her tea without looking up. "He says his mother's condition is delicate, that she gets overwhelmed. He doesn't want to upset her." Karen narrowed her eyes. "You're telling me Carol Whitman, the same woman who hosted a 4th of July barbecue for 30 people last year, now can't tolerate a call from her granddaughter?" Grace's lips pressed into a thin line. "He said the doctor recommended a calm environment, no visitors." Karen leaned back, folding her arms. "Grace, You're not a visitor. You're his wife. Zoe is his daughter. This doesn't add up." Grace looked away, her voice a whisper. "What if she really is sick, Karen? I've seen it happen. A stroke. Early onset dementia. Maybe she doesn't even recognize me anymore." Karen's tone softened, but her eyes remained sharp. "Then you'd be the first person he'd want there, not the one he keeps away." Silence fell between them for a beat. The clinking of silverware and low hum of conversation filled the gap. Karen reached across the table and covered Grace's hand with her own. "I know you want to believe the best in him," Karen said gently. "But something's off. I've seen too many cases like this. Women trusting too long, waking up too late." Grace exhaled slowly. Her phone buzzed. A message from Ethan. 2 words. "Busy now." No apology, no explanation, just confirmation of his absence. Later that night, after putting Zoe to bed, Grace stood in the kitchen, staring at the drawer that held their old photo albums. She hadn't opened it in months. But something compelled her. She pulled it open and retrieved the thick album labeled 2015, The Beginning. Inside were wedding photos, baby pictures, hospital snapshots with tiny Zoe swaddled in Ethan's arms. He had looked so happy. She had believed every smile. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was Karen. "If he's hiding something, you'll find out. I'll help you, but only if you're ready." Grace looked toward the hallway. Zoe was sleeping, her bedroom door cracked slightly open, her little girl, trusting the world, trusting her father. Grace typed back 1 word. "Yes." Then she added, "This weekend. We go to Austin. He won't see it coming." She placed the phone face down and closed the album. The warmth was gone, but the clarity, that was finally here. The sun had just begun to rise over the Texas horizon when Grace pulled out of the driveway. The sky stretched wide and pale above the quiet suburbs of Houston, casting a soft orange glow on the windshield. Zoe sat in the back seat, legs swinging, clutching her stuffed rabbit, and humming a tune only she seemed to know. "We're going to surprise Daddy, right?" she asked, her eyes bright, full of a hope Grace could barely stand to witness. Grace nodded, glancing at her through the rearview mirror. "Yes, baby. A surprise visit to see Daddy and Grandma Carol." Zoe smiled and looked out the window again, tracing her finger on the glass. Grace kept her eyes on the road, hands firm on the wheel, heart pounding in a rhythm that had nothing to do with traffic. The highway stretched out like a ribbon of uncertainty, and with every mile marker they passed, the memories of a very different road trip surfaced. Years ago, Ethan had driven her to Austin to meet his mother for the first time. Carol had welcomed Grace with warm biscuits, a floral apron, and a glint of something unreadable in her eyes. "She makes the best apple pie," Zoe chirped suddenly. "Daddy said hers is better than store-bought, even better than yours." Grace forced a smile. "She does bake a good pie," she replied, her voice tight. But it wasn't the pie Grace remembered most. It was how Carol had smiled too quickly, hugged her too lightly, and watched her too closely during that first Thanksgiving. Grace had chalked it up to nerves. Now she wondered if it had been something else entirely. The land outside turned from concrete sprawl to wide-open stretches of green fields and cattle fences. They passed gas stations, billboards half-faded by sun and rain, and the occasional roadside diner with blinking neon signs. The world seemed so normal. Deceptively so. "Will Grandma be okay?" Zoe asked, her tone quieter now. Grace exhaled slowly, keeping her gaze forward. "We'll see soon enough." Zoe nodded, leaning her head against the window, lulled by the motion. Grace glanced again in the mirror, watching her daughter's lashes flutter shut. But that innocence, the way children trusted what they were told, no matter how carefully wrapped the lie, it made her chest ache. As they neared Austin's outskirts, Grace's stomach turned. Her fingers tightened around the wheel. This wasn't a simple visit. This was a reckoning in disguise. She had brought a bag of Carol's favorite tea, a new wristwatch for Ethan, everything wrapped in soft paper labeled with lies. But underneath it all, inside the glove compartment, sat a folder with copies of Ethan's texts, his strange bank statements, and the receipt from the bakery. The one that read, "Happy 5th birthday, Noah." She hadn't shown it to Zoe. Not yet. Some truce had to wait until the door opened, until there was no more room left to run. Grace turned off the highway onto a narrower road flanked by tall maple trees. The GPS voice guided her through a few more turns, then announced, "You have arrived at your destination." She parked a few houses down, careful not to pull into the driveway. Zoe stirred in the back seat, blinking away sleep. "We're here?" she asked, rubbing her eyes. Grace nodded. "Almost, sweetheart. Let's stretch our legs a bit first." They got out, and Grace held Zoe's hand as they walked slowly down the sidewalk. Carroll Street, Maplewood Lane, looked more manicured than she remembered. Grace frowned. The lawn had always been unkempt, crabgrass curling along the edges, but now it was neatly trimmed, flowers blooming in precise lines along the walkway. There was even a red bird feeder swinging gently from the front porch, filled with fresh seeds. Zoe pointed to a small red bicycle near the porch. "That looks like mine." "It's not," Grace said quickly, though her voice faltered. "Probably belongs to a neighbor's kid." She didn't believe that. The front windows were open, the curtains fluttering lazily in the morning breeze. It was too quiet, too perfect. "Let's walk a little more," Grace said. As they passed the next house, a familiar voice called out, "Grace Whitman? My goodness, how long has it been?" Grace turned to see Helen Wilson, Carol's longtime neighbor, holding a leash attached to a shaggy little terrier. Her smile was bright, unassuming. "Helen," Grace said, summoning a polite smile, "you look well." "I could say the same. And look at Zoe. My, you've grown, darling." Helen crouched down to Zoe's level and chuckled. "Did you come to visit your grandma?" Grace hesitated. "Yes, she's still unwell, right?" Helen blinked. "Unwell? Carol? Oh dear, I must have misunderstood. I saw her just last week at the grocery store. She looked perfectly fine. Had her cart full of fruit, juice, and cereal. Must be for those grandkids of hers." Grace felt her stomach twist. "Grandkids?" "Oh, yes," Helen said brightly. "There was a little boy with her, curly hair, maybe 5 or so, quite the chatterbox. He called her Grandma Carol. I assumed you'd had another child?" Grace forced a smile and thanked Helen quickly, tugging Zoe gently by the hand. "We should go say hello now." As they walked away, Zoe looked up, confused. "Did Grandma get better? Daddy said she couldn't even stand." Grace didn't answer. Her mind was racing. A little boy, grandkids, cereal, and fruit. Carol wasn't sick. She was hosting someone else's child. They stopped a few feet from the front porch. Grace's hand trembled as she took out her phone and texted Karen, "We're here. Something's off. We'll keep you posted." Karen replied almost instantly, "Whatever happens, you're not alone. Keep your eyes open." Grace looked at Zoe, who was staring at the bicycle with a quiet frown. She bent down and tucked a strand of hair behind her daughter's ear. "Stay close to me, okay?" Then she took a deep breath and stepped forward toward the door that no longer felt like family. The porch steps creaked under their feet, but no one came to the door. Grace hesitated in front of it, her hand raised to knock. Then she noticed something. The door wasn't shut all the way. It hung slightly ajar, just enough to let out faint sounds. Voices, laughter, clinking glasses. Zoe tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mommy, I hear Daddy." Grace pressed a finger to her lips and bent down. "Let's wait just a moment." She gently eased Zoe to the side of the doorway and crouched beside her. Her heart thundered in her chest. A familiar male voice echoed from inside. "Ethan!" And another, female, younger, playful. Then a child's laughter. Grace's hand tightened around the edge of her purse as she dared to peek through the narrow gap in the doorway. There, in the living room, flooded with morning light, sat Ethan on the couch, his arm comfortably draped around a woman Grace didn't recognize. Blonde, maybe early 30s, wearing a soft gray sweater. She leaned into him like she belonged there. At their feet, a little boy with dark curls played with a set of wooden blocks, building towers and knocking them down. His voice carried clear and sweet. "Daddy, help me make the bridge again." "Daddy," the word hit Grace like a slap. Ethan chuckled and reached down, ruffling the boy's hair. "All right, buddy. One more time." The woman leaned over and kissed Ethan's cheek, and he smiled. The same smile Grace had memorized years ago. The one he used when rocking Zoe to sleep. That smile didn't belong to her anymore. It never had, maybe. A figure appeared from the kitchen. Carol. She looked nothing like the fragile woman Ethan had described for weeks. Her step was strong, confident. She carried a tray of lemonade in one hand, a plate of cookies in the other. "Jessica? Ethan, I brought snacks," she called out cheerfully. Then she looked down at the boy. "And Noah, I made your favorite." "Yay! Thank you, Grandma." Grandma. Grace's breath caught. Jessica. That was the name. The boy was Noah. And Carol wasn't bedridden. She was thriving, hosting tea and laughter like nothing in the world had ever gone wrong. Zoe moved slightly beside her, trying to peek in. "Is that—" Grace instinctively placed her hand over Zoe's mouth. Her daughter's wide eyes filled with confusion. Grace whispered, her voice a tremor, "Not yet. Don't say anything." Zoe looked up at her, tears brimming, and nodded. They crouched there, frozen in the doorway, watching a life that had been lived without them, constructed over lies and omissions. Every second that passed chipped away at the fragile wall Grace had built to keep herself from falling apart. She didn't cry, she didn't gasp, she watched, memorized, and when her hand finally moved, it was to reach for her phone. Her fingers shook as she opened the camera app, holding the phone just inside the crack of the door. The screen displayed everything. Ethan lounging on the couch, Jessica resting her head on his shoulder, little Noah giggling as he demolished another tower of blocks. Carol set the tray down on the coffee table, her face lit with joy. It was a portrait of a perfect family, a family Grace and Zoe were never meant to see. She pressed record. Her breath caught when Carol's voice rang out again. "Bill, I'm so glad you finally have your real family now." Bill. The name he hadn't used in years. Not since he married Grace and insisted on being called Ethan. Her stomach twisted as the woman who once hugged her on Christmas mornings now praised the very lie Grace had been living under. "You should have left that woman long ago," Carol continued. "I told you for years she never belonged here. Jessica is the woman you deserve." "I know, Mom," Ethan replied. "It just wasn't easy." Jessica's voice broke in, softer but urgent. "But what if she finds out? What if she knows about all of this?" "Don't worry," Ethan said. "Grace doesn't suspect a thing. She's always been simple, trusting." A sound escaped Grace's throat, something between a gasp and a sob, but she swallowed it before it could become real. Her grip tightened around the phone as the words replayed in her head. Simple, trusting. Jessica asked, "What about Zoe? She's your daughter." Ethan hesitated, then shrugged. "Grace will keep her. I have a new life now. Noah is enough." Zoe's hand slipped from Grace's, and before she could stop her, the child whispered, "He doesn't want me?" Tears filled Zoe's eyes. Grace pulled her close, wrapping her arms around her daughter's trembling frame and guiding her away from the door. They retreated silently behind a row of rose bushes, heartbeats pounding in their ears. Zoe buried her face in her mother's chest. "Is that Daddy? Why did he call that boy his son?" Grace didn't answer right away. Her voice had vanished into the throb of betrayal pounding in her ears. She brushed the hair from Zoe's face and kissed her forehead. "I don't know, sweetheart," she said finally. "But I promise I'm going to find out. And I will protect you, always." She turned back to the house, staring at the white door, the laughter still floating out. The life inside that house was built on lies, and now she had the evidence. She stopped the recording, checked the video twice, then saved it to a secure folder in her cloud storage. Her eyes burned, but she didn't let the tears fall. Instead, she held Zoe close and whispered, "Let's go home." They walked to the car in silence, the weight of truth anchoring every step. Grace didn't look back. She didn't have to. That door would open again, but next time, she'd be the one knocking with the law on her side. The motel room smelled faintly of lemon disinfectant and old carpet. The curtains were drawn tight against the mid-morning light, and the buzzing of a distant vending machine hummed through the thin walls. Grace sat on the edge of the bed, her hands gripping her phone so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. Zoe was curled beside her under a coarse motel blanket, her little body still trembling from the morning's revelations. Exhaustion had finally lulled her to sleep, but not before whispering one last time, "He called him son, Mommy. He meant it." Grace hadn't answered. There hadn't been words strong enough to erase that moment from her daughter's heart. Now, alone with the silence in her thoughts, Grace opened the video again. She watched it from start to finish. Carol's delighted voice, Jessica's anxious glances, Ethan's calm betrayal. She studied every movement, every phrase. She didn't flinch anymore. She felt. Still. Hollowed out and sharpened at once. The knock on the door came soft but steady. She opened it to find Karen standing in the hallway with 2 coffees and a bag of warm food from the gas station down the block. Her face shifted the moment she saw Grace's. "You saw it?" Karen said. Grace nodded, stepping aside to let her in. Karen placed the food down, then pulled Grace into a tight hug. "I'm so sorry." "I'm done being sorry," Grace whispered. "I'm ready to act." Karen sat across from her and opened her bag, pulling out a manila folder. "This is Elizabeth Cohen's number. She's a family attorney. She helped one of the nurses at the hospital during her custody case last year." "Sharp as hell." Grace took the card. Her hands were steadier now. "I want custody, sole custody, and I want every dollar that man ever tried to hide from me." Karen nodded. "And you'll get it, but first, evidence. That video's a start, the audio too. Do you have anything else?" Grace reached into her purse and pulled out a printed bank statement. "I transferred half of our joint savings to a separate account this morning, legal under Texas law. The rest he's likely used already." She set a second paper on the table, Zoe's birth certificate, and below it a newer document. A pediatric report for Noah Whitman, listing Ethan as the legal guardian. Karen scanned it. "He used your last name for his affair child." Grace nodded. "He erased Zoe and gave it to someone else." There was silence between them again. Then Grace's voice broke through, low and certain. "Tomorrow morning, I meet with Elizabeth." Karen didn't argue. Instead, she reached over and squeezed Grace's hand. "He thinks you're a woman who won't fight back." Grace looked toward the drawn curtains. "Then he's about to learn what it means to underestimate the wrong woman." The room was still, but inside her something had shifted. For the first time in weeks, the grief was replaced by clarity. Not vengeance, not cruelty, just truth. And the fire to make it matter. The next morning, Houston greeted them with a dull, overcast sky and the quiet hush of a city still waking up. Grace had left Zoe with her mother Judith just after sunrise. Her daughter had clung to her longer than usual, as if sensing that something important, something irreversible, was about to happen. "I'll be back soon," Grace had whispered, kneeling to meet Zoe's eyes. "And when I come back, things will start getting better. I promise." Judith had looked at her daughter with 1,000 unspoken questions, but said nothing. She simply nodded and took Zoe's hand, leading her inside. Now, standing in the waiting room of the Cohen Law Office, Grace felt the hum of fluorescent lights buzzing faintly above her. The walls were painted in muted gray tones, and a tall plant drooped slightly in the corner. A receptionist with silver glasses and a calm voice had led her in and offered coffee, which Grace declined. She didn't need caffeine. Her nerves were electric already. The door to the inner office opened. A woman in her mid-50s stepped out, tall, composed, her hair pulled into a tight chignon. She extended a hand. "Grace Whitman, I'm Elizabeth Cohen. Come in." Grace followed her into a sleek office lined with shelves of leather-bound books and case files. The large window overlooked downtown Houston's grid of streets and steel. Elizabeth motioned for her to sit. "I've been briefed by Karen," Elizabeth began, folding her hands neatly on the desk. "She said you have video and audio evidence of marital misconduct as well as financial documents and a minor child involved." Grace opened her purse and pulled out the USB drive, placing it carefully on the table. "It's all here. The video of him with the other woman, the child. His mother, healthy, clearly complicit. Their conversation about leaving me. Him saying our daughter doesn't matter." Elizabeth didn't flinch. She simply nodded once. "Good. That's strong. In Texas, community property law applies. What you've done with the savings is legal. Now we prepare your petition." Grace reached back into her folder, pulling out Zoe's pediatric history, school enrollment records, and Ethan's signed absence from parent-teacher meetings for the past year. "He hasn't been present, not as a father, not even as a name." Elizabeth examined the files carefully. "Will file for sole custody based on emotional abandonment and risk of parental inconsistency. This is winnable." Grace sat straighter, the weight on her shoulders shifting. "I don't want a drawn-out battle. I want it done clean. I want Zoe safe, and I want that man to never touch another piece of our life again." Elizabeth leaned forward slightly, eyes calm and deliberate. "Then we don't waste time. Tomorrow morning I'll submit the preliminary motion for divorce and full custody. But there's one more thing you need to do." "What's that?" Elizabeth smiled faintly. "Call your husband. Lie to him. Just one more time." An hour later, Grace sat in her parked car, the speakerphone active, hands steady. "Hey, it's me," she said when Ethan answered. "I just wanted to let you know I'm out of town for a few days, a conference in San Antonio. Zoe's staying with my mom." Ethan sounded relaxed. "Oh, okay. That's good. I'll call later." "Sure," Grace replied, smiling without warmth. "Talk soon." She ended the call, exhaled slowly, and texted Elizabeth one word. Done. There was no turning back now. The plan had begun. Chapter 5, Part 1. The Confrontation. Carol's house looked the same in the morning light as it had the day Grace first stepped onto that porch years ago as a nervous fiancée, except now the flowers bloomed too perfectly, the windows gleamed too brightly, and the front door felt like a stage curtain waiting to be pulled open. Grace stood beside Elizabeth, both women clad in quiet determination. A rental sedan waited across the street, its engine still ticking as it cooled. Grace's pulse thundered beneath her skin, but her face was unreadable. "Are you ready?" Elizabeth asked, her tone neutral but laced with strength. Grace didn't answer at first. Her eyes were fixed on the house. She could hear faint voices inside, muffled but distinct. Laughter. A child's. The same voice that had called Ethan Daddy while Zoe sat outside in silence. "I'm not here for revenge," Grace said quietly. "I'm here for truth." Elizabeth gave a single nod, then raised her hand and knocked. The sound echoed, once, twice, and then the door opened. Ethan appeared, shirt untucked, expression casual at first. When he registered Grace standing on the porch beside a woman in a tailored suit, something flickered behind his eyes. "Grace?" His voice cracked slightly. "What are you doing here?" Grace stepped forward. "We need to talk." Ethan glanced behind him, clearly uneasy. Now's not a good time. My mother's resting. Grace's voice was ice. Is that what you told Jessica too? That she should be quiet while you tell me more lies? Ethan's face drained of color. What are you— Grace, this is not. This is Elizabeth Cohen, my attorney. Grace moved past him without waiting for permission. You might want to get your story straight before we go to court. Elizabeth followed close behind. The living room was exactly as Grace remembered from the recording. The couch, the tray, the child-sized toys scattered on the rug. Noah was sitting cross-legged, building a castle of Legos, his soft curls bouncing as he looked up curiously. Jessica stood in the kitchen, frozen mid-step, a dish towel still clutched in her hand. Her face went pale when she saw Grace. "Oh my God!" From down the hall, Carol's voice rang out, sharp and irritated. "Ethan, who is it?" Then she stepped into view and stopped short. Her eyes narrowed. "You." Grace smiled without humor. "Hello, Carol. You look quite well for someone supposedly bedridden." "I want you out of my house," Carol snapped. "Now," Elizabeth stepped forward calmly, "I don't think that's possible today. I'm here on behalf of Mrs. Whitman to deliver formal documents. Divorce petition and application for sole custody of her daughter, Zoe." Jessica gasped. Ethan looked like he'd forgotten how to speak. Carol's mouth opened, but Elizabeth silenced her with a raised hand. "I would advise you to remain quiet until legal counsel is present. Everything from this point forward may be submitted in court." Jessica stepped forward shakily. "Wait. I thought she left you. You told me she didn't want the baby, that you weren't even married anymore." Grace turned her eyes to Ethan, who visibly flinched. "You told her that?" Ethan tried to speak. "Grace, I was trying to protect—" "Protect who?" Grace's voice cut through him. "You lied to me, you lied to her, you lied to your own daughter. You thought if you kept all your plates spinning, none of us would notice they were built on sand." Carol stepped between them. "Ethan, call the police." Grace didn't even look at her. She reached into her purse and pulled out a flash drive, placing it gently on the coffee table beside Noah's half-built castle. "That's the video, the audio, your voices, your words, your betrayal." Ethan's eyes widened. "You recorded us?" "I recorded the truth," Grace said, "and now I'm walking away with it." The room fell into stunned silence. Elizabeth broke it with a final line. "You'll be served formally by Monday. We recommend securing counsel. Immediate." Grace turned to leave, her steps slow but steady. As she passed Noah, he looked up at her with the innocence only a child could possess. Her heart clenched, but she kept moving. She didn't need to win this argument. She had already won the war. The front door slammed shut behind them, but Grace didn't flinch. She walked slowly down the stone path, the wind tugging gently at the hem of her coat. The sky had darkened with thick, indifferent clouds, and for a moment she welcomed the weight of it. Something to match the heaviness in her chest. Elizabeth caught up to her near the curb. "You handled that better than most clients I've ever worked with." Grace looked straight ahead. "I've been practicing for weeks. In my head, I've said every word 100 times. Elizabeth gave a curt nod. "Now we make it real." They got into the car, and Grace gripped the steering wheel before even turning the key. Her fingers curled slowly, the leather cold under her touch. "He said Zoe wasn't enough, that he had a new family, like she's a coat you take off when the season changes." Elizabeth didn't speak right away. Her silence wasn't empty. It was permission for Grace to fill it. "I believed him," Grace said. "I believed every excuse, every late reply, every lie about his mother's health. I even felt guilty, thinking maybe I wasn't being understanding enough." She let out a bitter laugh. "Turns out I was being erased." Elizabeth looked over, her voice low and measured. "You were being manipulated. That's different, is what people like him do. They twist truth into convenience." Grace's phone vibrated. A text. From Ethan. "What are you trying to do? Why are you ruining everything?" She didn't respond. Instead, she opened her gallery, selected the most damning video, and uploaded it to her attorney's shared case folder. Evidence was no longer a secret. It was ammunition. Across town, Judith had just finished reading Zoe her favorite book when the knock came. Grace had texted ahead, letting her mother know she'd be arriving late, but instead it was Zoe's father who stood at the door. "Is Grace here?" Ethan asked, feigning calm, though his tie was loose and his voice lacked its usual confidence. Judith stared at him for a long second before stepping outside and closing the door behind her. "She's not interested in seeing you, and frankly, neither am I," she said flatly. "I just want to talk." "You had years to talk. You chose lies instead." Ethan shifted uncomfortably. "Zoe's still my daughter." "She's not a backup plan," Judith replied. "And she's not your shield from the consequences you brought on yourself." She turned and went back inside, locking the door firmly behind her. Back at the motel, Grace sat cross-legged on the bed, Zoe leaning against her side, eating crackers and watching a cartoon on mute. The flickering screen lit their faces softly. "Are we going to live here now?" Zoe asked, her voice quiet. "No, sweetie," Grace said gently. "Just for now. We're finding somewhere better, somewhere new." Zoe nodded. "Without Daddy?" Grace paused, then kissed the top of her head. "Without anyone who chooses not to love us the way we deserve." That night, Grace couldn't sleep. She stood at the window, watching headlights pass in and out of the parking lot. The city didn't care about her heartbreak. The world hadn't stopped. That, strangely, brought her comfort. In the morning, she would begin again, not just as a mother reclaiming custody, not just as a woman divorcing a liar, but as someone who had crawled out of the wreckage with her head high and a map in hand. And for the first time in months, she knew exactly where she was going. A single pink balloon bounced gently above the mailbox of Grace's new apartment. It bobbed with the rhythm of the breeze, casting a small shadow on the walkway as the midday sun spilled over the modest building in Midtown Houston. Inside, the apartment was alive with voices, laughter, clinking cups, the sound of Zoe's footsteps darting across the hardwood floor. Grace stood in the kitchen, slicing apples for a pie she never thought she'd have the strength to bake again. Her mother, Judith, was arranging plates on the dining table with the practiced calm of someone who had held her family together through every storm. Laura, Grace's younger sister, knelt beside Zoe, helping her tie the ribbons on the stack of birthday gifts sent by classmates and neighbors. 8 years old, Laura said, grinning. "Feels like just yesterday she was stealing cake frosting off your spoon." "She still does," Grace replied, chuckling. "She's just taller about it now." Karen arrived a few minutes later, arms full of Tupperware, and her 2 sons trailing behind her with noise and energy. She placed the food on the counter and immediately pulled Grace into a hug. "Congratulations," she whispered. "Not just for surviving him, for choosing something better." Grace smiled, not because she felt triumphant, but because it was finally quiet inside her head. 3 months had passed since the confrontation. The divorce was finalized in less than 6 weeks. Ethan had tried to negotiate, to threaten, to guilt his way into leniency, but the video spoke louder than his lawyer ever could. Grace was awarded full custody of Zoe and half of the marital assets, most of which Ethan had already squandered. Carol refused to show up in court. Jessica never returned Ethan's calls after discovering he'd lied to her, too. And Noah? Grace didn't know what had happened to the boy she once saw building Lego castles in the living room of Betrayal. She thought of him sometimes, not with anger, but with the solemn compassion of a mother. He didn't ask to be part of the lie either, but today wasn't about the past. Today was about a cake with purple frosting, a paper crown slightly too big for Zoe's head, and the moment when the lights dimmed and everyone began to sing. Zoe stood behind her cake, her cheeks flushed, her eyes bright. She looked at Grace, then at the faces gathered around the room, Judith, Laura, Karen, and the boys from school, and beamed. "This is the best birthday ever," she said simply. Grace leaned in and whispered, "Make a wish, baby." Zoe closed her eyes, drew in a breath, and blew out all 8 candles in one determined gust. Applause erupted. Grace clapped along, the sound echoing in her chest, reverberating through a place that had once been cracked and hollow. Later, while the children tore open wrapping paper and Karen poured juice into plastic cups, Grace stepped out onto the small balcony. She needed a moment. Just one. The air was warm and smelled faintly of lavender from the neighbor's planter below. She closed her eyes and listened. Not to what was around her, but to the silence within her. No ache, no doubt, just space. She turned and looked back through the sliding door, where Zoe danced around the room in a blur of color and ribbons. Her daughter had healed in small ways, in laughter, in friendship, in the promise of a life not defined by who left, but by who stayed. Grace pressed her hand lightly to the glass, then smiled to herself. This wasn't a new beginning. It was the beginning she should have had all along. From the second-floor balcony, Grace spotted the car before it fully pulled into view. It was an older model sedan, silver, dusty, tired-looking. It crawled to a stop across the street, its engine idling for several seconds before shutting off. The driver didn't exit. The window stayed up. But she didn't need to see his face to know who it was. Ethan. She hadn't seen him in person since the court hearing. He'd sat on the opposite side of the room, shoulders slouched, dark circles under his eyes, suit wrinkled. He hadn't said a word, hadn't made a scene. But that silence had not come from dignity. It came from defeat. Grace watched as the silhouette inside the car leaned forward, resting against the steering wheel for a long time. Then, slowly, the window rolled down, and for a moment their eyes met from across the street. Just a flash of recognition, not longing, not regret. Just the void of something that used to be. Karen stepped out onto the balcony behind her and followed Grace's gaze. "Is that him?" she asked quietly. Grace didn't respond right away. She simply nodded. Karen crossed her arms. "He looks smaller." "He is," Grace said. "He just never knew it." For several minutes they stood there, neither woman speaking, the distance between them and Ethan as tangible as the concrete sidewalk. Finally, the car pulled away. No honk, no wave. Just a slow, silent departure, the same way he'd always slipped out of responsibility. Quietly, cowardly. Grace didn't move until the car disappeared entirely from view. Back inside, the party had moved into the cozy den. Laura was showing the kids how to build a fort with throw pillows and blankets. Zoe was perched on a beanbag chair, wearing her paper crown sideways now, her face flushed from laughter. Judith approached Grace in the kitchen, wiping her hands on a napkin. "He came, didn't he?" Grace nodded. "He watched from the car." "Didn't come in?" Judith studied her daughter's face. "Do you wish he had?" Grace looked over at Zoe. "No, I'm glad she didn't see him today. She deserves a day that's hers." Judith placed a warm hand on Grace's back. "You gave that to her. You gave her a life where love isn't confusing." Grace swallowed the lump rising in her throat. "I just didn't want her to grow up thinking she had to earn it." The party winded down after an hour, and guests slowly trickled out with hugs and kind words. Karen promised a dinner soon, Laura offered to do dishes, and Judith began boxing up leftovers. When the apartment finally quieted, Zoe padded over in her fuzzy socks, holding one of her new books. "Will you read to me?" she asked, already climbing into her bed. Grace smiled and followed her into the bedroom. The walls were painted a warm lilac, with glow-in-the-dark stars still charging under the ceiling light. The book was about a girl who built a raft out of scraps and floated downriver to find her own place in the world. It wasn't subtle, but Grace didn't mind. Some truths are worth telling plainly. Halfway through the story, Zoe interrupted. "Mom?" "Yes, baby?" "Did you ever feel like I wasn't enough?" Grace blinked. What? Back when Daddy said those things, that Noah was enough. Grace closed the book and turned to face her daughter fully. Zoe, listen to me. Her voice was steady, though her chest tightened. You were never not enough. You are the very best part of my life. What your dad said, those were his choices, his mistakes. They have nothing to do with you. Zoe was quiet for a long moment. Then she whispered, I didn't cry when I saw him today. Not even inside. Grace leaned down and kissed her forehead. That's because you're strong. You're becoming someone who knows their worth. Zoe smiled softly and closed her eyes. Within minutes, her breathing had slowed, steady and calm. Grace lingered a little longer, brushing a strand of hair off her daughter's cheek before turning off the lamp. She stood in the doorway, one hand on the frame, watching as moonlight filtered through the blinds and danced across the floor. Later that night, after the apartment had gone still, Grace sat alone on the balcony again. She held a single candle in her hands, the kind Zoe had used on the cake. She hadn't lit it then, hadn't wanted to. But now, in the hush of the evening, she did. The flame flickered against the night wind, but didn't go out. She thought of everything she had lost, yes. But more than that, she thought of what she'd reclaimed. Not just freedom or safety or truth, but space. The kind of space where she could breathe fully, love openly, and raise a daughter without shadows hanging over her name. The past would always be there, tucked in the corners of memory like old bruises, but it no longer dictated the room. Across the city, Ethan would return to a dim apartment filled with echoing silences. His second family had unraveled after Jessica discovered his lies ran deeper than even she knew. Carol had fallen ill, truly this time, and the one woman who once orchestrated deception was now relying on state nurses and dwindling savings. Grace wouldn't gloat. That wasn't the point. The point was this. She had not just survived, she had rebuilt. And this quiet, flickering moment, was her real birthday wish for Zoe. A future not built on vengeance or fear, but one lit by the steady, stubborn flame of knowing exactly who you are and refusing to forget it again. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. This wasn't just a story about a broken marriage. It was a story about the quiet kind of strength, the kind that doesn't yell, doesn't seek revenge for the sake of ego, but instead chooses truth, healing, and the protection of what matters most. Grace didn't fight to punish her husband. She didn't return to destroy him. She returned to protect her daughter, to reclaim her voice, to take back her name from the lies others tried to write over it. We often hear about dramatic betrayals in the headlines, the loud scandals, the public downfalls. But the most devastating betrayals are the silent ones, the ones that happen inside homes with closed curtains, the ones where love is withdrawn gradually, where silence replaces conversation, where loyalty is met with manipulation. Grace's story is for every woman who has asked herself, am I imagining this? For every mother who has tried to protect her child from a truth too painful to name. For every person who stayed too long because they believed things might get better. And most of all, it's for the ones who left. For those who walked away not in anger, but in dignity. Who chose a new beginning over the false comfort of familiarity. Because healing doesn't always come with grand speeches or cinematic moments. Sometimes healing is quiet. Sometimes it looks like sleeping in your own bed without anxiety, or watching your child laugh again, free from the weight of adult disappointment. Sometimes healing is knowing that someone who once tried to erase you no longer has the power to write your ending. If this story spoke to something in your heart, we invite you to share it. Not for clicks, not for views, but because stories like Grace's are far more common than we think. Too many women suffer in silence, believing that no one else would understand. But you are not alone, and your silence doesn't have to be the closing chapter. We also want to honor the real-life graces out there. The women rebuilding from broken marriages, the mothers raising their children on their own, the daughters breaking cycles, the friends who show up when things fall apart, and the therapists, the attorneys, the support systems who help survivors turn their pain into power. And to the people watching this and thinking, that could have been me, maybe it was, maybe it still is. If so, we hope you take this as your reminder. You are not weak for trusting. You are not foolish for loving. And you are absolutely allowed to start again, even if the past is messy, even if the truth hurts, even if it means walking away from people who share your blood, but not your values. Because family isn't defined by names on a birth certificate. It's defined by love, respect, and the willingness to show up even when things are hard. As we close this chapter, know this. Grace didn't need to burn everything down. She simply stood in her truth and let the truth do the rest. And sometimes that's the most powerful ending of all. Thank you for listening. We'll see you in the next story. Until then, protect your peace and never let anyone else write your worth.